Okay, so I've detected a certain kind of level of interest here in when are we going to talk about theology, philosophy, which is good. I mean, often it is the case in these Faraday courses, we tend to start, not always, but often we start with a lot of science and, the background of the science, and then we sort of get more theological or more philosophical as the weekend goes on. So I think that's probably what's going to happen over the course of this weekend. I can't really say I'm going to talk a lot about theology, given the topic that we've got here before us, although we will get into some theology as we go along. And I think by the time we get to the panel discussion, keep filling up your questions in the box, because then we can have a good kind of theological discussion on the panel as well, which is always good fun. Okay, so we've come to a kind of different kind of topic now, this critique of intelligent design. And I realize that for some people here, intelligent design is something that you're familiar with. I guess if you come to the USA, you've heard a lot about it, maybe to a certain extent if you're from a European country, possibly. Maybe if you're from some other country, it may be something that you don't hear about at all. And so I want to spend quite a bit of time in just sort of introducing this topic, because I think if we're going to critique something, then clearly we need to understand what it's about. And I want to be fair to the ID, I'm going to call it ID, intelligent design proponents, because I know quite a few of them, and what I don't want to do here is to be polemical or to be confrontational or anything like that. So my critique will be, I hope, a gentle academic type of critique, and one that we can then have a discussion about. So let's just think a little bit about the very notion of design. I mean, the understanding of the word design, of course, has a very long history indeed. It goes back to the Stoic philosophers. It was popularized by the Roman historian Cicero in his book, The Nature of the Gods. It was then taken up by the early Christian thinkers, such as Tertullian, in the early years of the church, as a way of promoting belief in God to the surrounding pagan world. And some pagans even wanted Cicero's book to be suppressed because he was just being, Cicero's book, yes, but to be suppressed because it was being used so successfully by Christian writers. So here we have, speaking for the Stoics, Cicero wrote that when we see a mechanism such as a planetary model or a clock, do we doubt that it is the creation of a conscious intelligence? So how can we doubt that the world is the work of the divine intelligence? We may well believe that the world and everything in it has been created for the gods and for humankind. And then Cicero himself reports these anti-religious sort of objections, which were presented at a time by the atomists, who said the world was made by a natural process without any need of a creator. Atoms come together and are held by mutual attraction. Thus are created all the forms of nature which you imagine can only be created by some divine craftsman. And I read those two contrasting kind of positions summarized there very nicely for us by Cicero. I somehow feel nothing much has changed in this debate in the past 2,000 years. And on one side you have this notion of the divine intelligence as the ultimate explanation for the order and complexity that we see in the universe around us, and then on the other side we have this idea of a natural process without any need of a creator, and in a sense this has remained these two competing views ever since. Now the Christian natural philosophers of the early modern period loved their machine analogies, and of course they were always God's machines, but they had this very sort of, especially in the 17th century, this very kind of mechanistic picture of the universe. And Robert Boyle, who was one of the founders of modern chemistry in the 17th century, one of the founders of the Royal Society, had this famous metaphor that he loved, which was the world was running in a clockwork way, rather like the famous clock at Strasbourg. And the clock at Strasbourg was always held up as to be the ultimate kind of wonderful machine. But he was very careful to point out, as you'll see in this quotation here, very careful to point out there was no intermediate between God and matter. So let's just read this quotation. It's quite interesting and relevant to our topic today. Boyle says it more sets off the wisdom of God in the fabric of the universe, that he can make so vast a machine perform all those many things which he designed it should, by the mere contrivance of brute matter, managed by certain laws of local motion, and upheld by his ordinary and general concourse, than if from time to time he employed an intelligent overseer, such as nature is fancied to be, to regulate, assist, and control the motions of the parts. I mean, sorry, in the 17th century they spoke in very long sentences, and I have to apologize for that. But basically, Boyle is saying, look, there's God and there's matter, everything that exists. We don't have anything in between. There's no intermediary. That's his point here. And so, at the same time, his clockwork universe needed no fine adjustments because it was made by a very fine craftsman. Now, let's think also about one of the reformers. This is the reformer John Calvin, again from the same period, a little bit earlier actually. Now, he insisted that concerning inanimate objects, we ought to hold that although each one has by nature been endowed with its own property, yet it does not exercise its own power except insofar as it is directed by God's ever-present hand. These are thus nothing but instruments to which God continually imparts as much effectiveness as he wills, and according to his own purpose bends and turns them to either one action or another. And so for Calvin, when he's writing his commentary there on Genesis and so on, nature was continuous, it was complete, it was a complete matrix, if you like, of God's activity and upholding. So there were no gaps in Calvin's thinking that you could attribute to forces or agents which were somehow outside of God's upholding power. In other words, here we have an attack on the idea, the Greek idea of some philosophers, that nature was in some sense autonomous, and they are critiquing the idea of autonomous nature. So for Calvin, it was the word of God, the command of God, was the only thing that was necessary to bring all things into being and to sustain them in their being and in their particular properties. But then we come to the 18th century, you find that the clockwork universe, which was definitely God's universe, clockwork universe in the 17th century, but now it's beginning to become more autonomous, if you like, in the hands of the deists like Voltaire and even more so some of the French philosophes. So we find Voltaire as he carried on an imaginary debate with a modern atheist in his Dictionary of Philosophy, 1764. This is a quote from Voltaire: "When we see a beautiful machine, we say that there is a good engineer, and this engineer has excellent judgment. The world is assuredly an admirable machine, therefore there is in the world an admirable intelligence, wherever it may be. This argument is old, and none the worse for that." Close quote. So here we see in Voltaire, God is not the personal God of Boyle and Calvin. God is now a sort of intelligence, rather ill-defined. Voltaire would be more in the sort of deistic category. Definitely not an atheist. Of course, very critical of institutionalized religion. But we're beginning to see a kind of shift towards the notion of an intelligence without which we cannot explain the world, but we have left behind the personal, involved God of Robert Boyle and Calvin and other people of the 17th century. Now when we come to the 19th century, it's quite interesting. We begin to see this phrase intelligent design being used in all kinds of different ways in the 19th century. Here's an example from 1874. There was a very fiery Irish physicist called John Tyndall. He was quite famous because he described for the first time the role of carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, so we ought to remember him, thank him for that. But he gave a famous lecture to the British Association for the Advancements of Science in Belfast in 1874. There he attacked the stranglehold of religion upon the institutions of education of Ireland. And his speech caused a tremendous reaction in Belfast at that time, and he extolled the views of the atomist Lucretius and the way that he combats the notion that the constitution of nature has been in any way determined by intelligent design. So for him, for Tyndall, the idea of intelligent design was a sort of, was a bit of an enemy. But meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, and actually only a decade later, we find James McCosh. James McCosh was a committed Christian. He was the president of what was to become Princeton University. He was one of the many Christian academics in North America who welcomed Darwinism to North America at that time. I don't know if you realize this, although now in North America more than 40% of the population don't like Darwin, they disagree with evolution. But in the 19th century, Darwinism was popularized by Christian academics in North America, and here's James McCosh as one of these good examples. And so holding strongly then to the concept of natural selection, he's speaking to the student body at that time. I think he'd been in Princeton for 20 years at that time, and he said that he equally believed that the natural origin of species is not inconsistent with intelligent design in nature or with the existence of a personal creator of the world. And he goes on to say in his speech, I've been defending evolution, but in so doing have given the proper account of it as the method of God's procedure, and find that when so understood, it is in no way inconsistent with Scripture. Pretty standard position of a Christian academic in North America in that particular era. Now, what's interesting here is he's using the phrase intelligent design to refer to natural selection. Okay, so here we have an illustration of the way in which certain phrases are not stable in their meaning. You have to look at the context, you have to look at the geography, you have to look at the history. Where are you, to understand what this particular phrase means. So, what about then today? Now today it's quite possible to have a discussion, and I've been involved in these discussions sometimes on radio or whatever, about intelligent design and some of the panel discussion. And what you find is all the people around the table have a different idea in their heads about what we're talking about. Okay, so you really have to define your terms in this discussion. Now clearly, intelligent design with a big I and a big D, in the way I'm going to refer to it today, is not the same as creationism, although the media frequently kind of puts them together, but they are distinct. I would say it's fair to say that intelligent design, big I, big D, is a first cousin of creationism, but it's not the same thing. There is also then, of course, intelligent design with a small I and a small d, and that's more the kind of design of the Stoics. That's more the traditional arguments from design that go back 2,000 years, inferring the existence of God or even the characteristics of God based upon the properties of the universe as we study them in science and so on. So I guess that particular belief is just simply incorporated within all the Abrahamic faiths certainly, and probably many other faiths as well, the idea that there is some intrinsic, there is a God who is a creator, and who has brought everything into being in an intelligible way. He's the great mathematician, as the 17th century scientists, natural philosophers used to think about him, and so we can understand and investigate the universe that he's brought into being. Now, let's go back then to the other full meaning of intelligent design, big I, big D. This is a particular cultural movement that really started emerging in the United States in the early 1990s with the publication of this book, Darwin on Trial, by Philip Johnson. This is the Philip Johnson who's the University of California law professor. He's now retired. And as I say, I'm going to use this acronym, I'm going to use the ID abbreviation to refer to this particular movement. It's a distinct body of ideas. It's an anti-Darwinian movement. It's now associated with the Discovery Institute in Seattle, so it has an institutional incorporation, and it refers to a group of proponents who are really putting forward a similar set of ideas, although we'll see in a moment they do vary quite a bit in their views. A leading ID proponent, Stephen Meyer, who did his PhD, by the way, here in Cambridge in the philosophy of science, defines ID as, and I quote, the deliberate choice of a conscious, intelligent agent or person to effect a particular outcome, end, or objective, close quote. We'll come back to some different kinds of definitions of ID in just a moment. Now, Philip Johnson recounts how he was on sabbatical at University College London in 1987 when he came across Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. And it was Dawkins' assertions about evolution as a godless process together with what Johnson perceived anyway as its lack of evidence, that spurred him into this sort of anti-Darwinian crusade. And I think there's a certain irony in a reflection that it was the writings of Richard Dawkins that actually triggered the initiation of this very anti-Darwinian movement of intelligent design. Now, a central point of attack, a central target for Johnson's attacks was the naturalism that he saw pervading science in general and evolution in particular. And impressed by Dawkins, Johnson saw evolution, and I quote from his writings, as a materialistic process in which God played no part, writing that evolution in the Darwinian sense is by definition mindless and godless. So he's sort of drawing a particular ideological view of evolution, which he's taken out of the writings of Richard Dawkins. And so theistic evolutionists who saw evolution as a description of the creative process whereby God brings about biological diversity in the way we've been thinking about this morning, these were not really welcomed by Johnson. He described the idea of evolution as a God-guided system of gradual creation as a mistake. And so other influential books then written by ID proponents followed on from those of Johnson. They came from rather different perspectives. There's a biochemist, Michael Behe, from Lehigh University. He published this book, Darwin's Black Box, back in 1996. And I don't know if you've read the book, but he describes fairly a whole series of very well-established biochemical pathways, and then claims that these are irreducibly complex in the sense that you cannot explain them, or according to him, by gradual Darwinian incremental sort of processes and things like that. More recently, Behe has published another book, The Edge of Evolution. 2010, Steve Meyer published this book called Signature in the Cell. And again, all of these books are really seeking to say that all the stuff we were looking at with Stephen Freeland this morning, complexity of the cell, transcription, translation, and so on, the central dogma, the way cellular biology works, all of that is irreducibly complex. They're trying to claim you cannot explain that evolution of those sort of entities because they need all the components to operate together to actually exist. Now, in the year of Behe's Darwin's Black Box, the Discovery Institute in Seattle, I just mentioned, became the flagship of the ID movement, and in the late 1990s, the center issued what they called the wedge strategy. They stated that we're seeking nothing less than the overthrow of materialism and its damning cultural legacies. And so they brought together leading scholars from the natural sciences and those on the humanities and social sciences to try and kind of attack what they saw as a materialistic agenda in the scientific community. And so this wedge document continues, and I quote from it, "The center explores how the new development in biology, physics, and cognitive science raise serious doubts about scientific materialism and have reopened the case for the supernatural." Now, one of the fellows who was appointed at that time to the center, this Discovery Center, is called William Dembski. He's got doctorates in both philosophy and also in mathematics, and since that time he's emerged as one of the leading proponents in this particular movement. He's written a whole series of books. The first of these, The Design Inference, Eliminating Chance Through Small Probabilities, 1998. That was probably the most technical one from a mathematical point of view. And what he's seeking to do there is to distinguish design from apparent design. Then there were more popular works like Intelligent Design, The Bridge Between Science and Theology, 1999, in many ways the manifesto of the intelligent design movement, and then the Design Revolution in 2004, in which Dembski addresses the various questions and objections that have been raised by people to intelligent design. Now, actually, when you look at the ID proponents, they do vary quite a bit in their attitudes towards Darwinism. The Presbyterian Philip Johnson, for example, has been resolutely opposed to anything except variation within species. He sees all arguments from natural selection as displaying naturalism. The Catholic Michael Beattie is quite different, actually. He accepts common descent. He accepts much of the sort of evolutionary history that those of us who are Darwinians would accept, but he sort of draws a line at what he perceives to be these irreducibly complex entities, like the bacterial flagellum we'll come to in a moment. But there are certain things he says that Darwinism cannot explain, you know, and so he draws a line at that point. Then you have Bill Dembski, the chap I just mentioned. Until recently he was research professor in philosophy at the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in the States. He's sort of taken a more kind of middle position, and he often expresses doubt in his writings about common descent, but on the other hand, in other places he'll say that ID is compatible with common descent and so on. So he's sort of a little bit ambiguous there, I think, in some of his writings on this topic. And we shouldn't think that all of the ID proponents have religious commitments. They do not. A few years ago I took part in a debate in Dallas, Texas, on ID. It was hosted by an Episcopalian church. Actually, it wasn't in Dallas, it was in Fort Worth. No, I think about it. Anyway, this was held in, I don't forget any Texans there, but this was held in big Texan style, with a huge, great auditorium, 1,000 people there. I was paired with Lawrence Krauss, who is quite a well-known atheist and circles in North America, and our job was to critique ID. But the interesting part was that defending ID was an atheistic philosopher called Bradley Monton from the University of Colorado, and a writer also who lives in Paris called David Belinsky, who didn't seem to get the impression he had any particular strong religious commitments. And in fact, Monton has published a book entitled Seeking God in Science: An Atheist Defends Intelligent Design. I've also debated Steve Fuller in this country, who's a professor of sociology at Warwick University, quite a historian of science as well. I think he would call himself agnostic. We've debated a couple of times and usually had quite a sort of friendly discussion on that. But so I think it's true to say, you have to say there's quite a lot of variation. We cannot simply say, you know, ID is a kind of like a creationist crusade of some kind. Probably in this country, intelligent design views are found more amongst the Christian community, and I think some Christians would see that as part of their sort of apologetics or defense of their faith in some way. But what does unite, if you like, this gives a core idea to all these ID proponents, is this sort of antipathy to Darwinian evolution as an inference to the best explanation for all the biological diversity that we see in the world. Now, more positively, Dembski has stated that intelligent design is three things. It's a scientific research program that investigates the effects of intelligent causes. It's an intellectual movement that challenges Darwinism and its naturalistic legacy. And thirdly, it's a way of understanding divine action. Quoting here from Dembski, intelligent design therefore intersects science and theology. 1999 in that case. Now, what exactly do the proponents of ID mean when they say that ID is a scientific research program that investigates the effects of intelligent causes? The core idea of ID in this context can be summarized in, again, the words of Dembski. I'm always very keen to allow proponents of something to tell something in their own words, because I think that's a fair way of addressing what people are claiming. So here are the words. This is what Dembski says. First of all, specified complexity is well defined and empirically detectable. I'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, undirected natural causes are incapable of explaining specified complexity. And then thirdly, intelligent causation best explains specified complexity. Let's come into the first point there. So with regard to the first point, Dembski writes that intelligence leaves behind a characteristic trademark or signature, what I call specified complexity. An event exhibits specified complexity if it is contingent and therefore not necessary. If it is complex and therefore not readily repeatable by chance, and if it is specified in the sense of exhibiting an independently given pattern. So Specifying complexity, therefore, in this sort of view, refers to events that are not imposed upon the data after the event. For example, Dembski gives the example of somebody shooting an arrow at a wall at random, and then you draw a circle around the arrow once it's hit the wall. Okay, that wouldn't render that event specified because you're looking at it after the event. So to define events then characterized by specified complexity, Dembski introduces what he calls an explanatory filter that can be used to infer design. So this filter has various sort of decision nodes. He thinks in a very, if you're used to computing language or IT language, you'll be much more at home with this kind of language than we biologists, I can tell you that. But okay, here's a filter. So various things have to sort of pass through the filter, if you like, in order to be defined as designed. First of all, you ask, is it a necessary or contingent event, object, or system? For example, the structure of an ice crystal is necessary in the sense that its structure is defined by the laws of physics, even though it is a unique structure and therefore it's not designed in Dembski's terminology. When, if you've seen the film Contact, it's all about SETI researchers and so on, and when they detected a signal from outer space of 1,126 beats and pauses, where the ones correspond to beats and the zeros to pauses, they inferred a sequence representing the prime numbers from 2 to 101. And they took that as decisive confirmation of the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence. So it's specifying complexity. The second decision node then is to ask whether the object event or system could arise by chance, or is it complex? For example, had the SETI researchers received only 8 beats and pauses, then they could have concluded that was a chance event, insufficiently complex to infer intelligence. And so to distinguish between events that are merely improbable and those that are really complex, Dembski imposes what he calls this universally probability-bound value of 10 to the 150, so that any specified event of probability less than 1 in 10 to the 150 will remain improbable even after all conceivable probabilistic resources from the observable universe have been factored in. In other words, if you just take a very, very big number, then you sort of try and say this is so improbable that it's actually even greater in probability than this sort of universally probability-bound kind of number. The third decision node addresses the question as to whether the object, event, or system is specified, and by this Dembski wishes to suggest that being contingent and complex per se are insufficient to infer design. In addition, it must be shown that there is an unmistakable pattern that displays intelligence. And so Dembski pictures the 10 billion possible ways of you might get a combination for a lock safe. If one of them works first time to open the safe, then you'd have to say that's specified for the robber in question, because in that context, the opening of the safe just couldn't have happened by chance in that view. Well, it could have done actually, but that would be pretty unexpected if you were a robber and you had 10 billion opportunities to open the safe and you hit it the one first time. That's the kind of analogy he's using here. So the object or event or system that passes through all these sort of 3 nodes or stages of the explanatory filter is then inferred in Dembski's scheme to infer, to display design and therefore to show signs of intelligence rather than coming about through, quote, natural causes, close quote. Now, Michael Behe's examples of supposedly irreducibly complex systems in biology are then kind of taken as the exemplars par excellence. These are the top examples of these sort of specified complexity in practice. For example, he takes the bacterial flagellum, which, as you may know, is a 30 to 40 protein component of this little kind of upward motor which bacteria have for swimming around, flagella, and so on. It is a complex and beautifully constructed kind of system. B, he takes things like cell biology or blood clotting, that kind of thing. Anything really that's where you need all the components to be together at the same time. And the argument is that how could that evolve by gradual Darwinian incremental processes, because you need all the components of the system together to give you its functionality. So it's important to realize, I think, in assessing these kinds of claims that by empirical, the ID proponents mean the assessment of a system according to these kinds of criteria. They're not actually doing experiments here. These are kind of thought experiments. That's what they mean by empiricism. Now, the overall goal of these types of arguments are made very explicit through the publications of the proponents of ID. In the words of Dembski, ID, and I quote from Dembski, argues that God's design is accessible to scientific inquiry. The crucial point, says Dembski, is that design is empirically detectable, close quote. Another quote, it was Darwin's expulsion of design from biology that made possible the triumph of naturalism in Western culture. So too it will be intelligent design's reinstatement of design within biology that will be the undoing of naturalism in Western culture, close quote. I think a real rewriting of history at that point, if ever there was one, but that's the quotation. Okay, so since ID proponents are very insistent here that what they're talking about is representing science, and therefore should be taught in science classrooms in the United States, and therefore get around the separation between church and state, which disallows you from talking about religion in US science classrooms and so forth. So I think it's quite fair to ask whether their core ideas do in fact display the characteristics of science. And as far as biology is concerned, which is, as we've seen, is a big focus of the ID movement, there are, I guess, at least three criteria that we expect from a scientific hypothesis. First, there should be a plausible hypothesis or model that has real explanatory value, that it gives new insights into the origins and functionings of living things. For example, the notion that all living creatures were connected up in this great chain of being, as it was called in previous centuries, in pre-Darwinian times, was a very popular idea in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, all the way through. But it didn't really explain how all those living creatures came into being. It was, of course, Darwin's brilliance to connect up the points and to make a tree, that wonderful tree picture we saw this morning. And so Darwin's theory, certainly in my view, gave for the first time a coherent account of how history comes into biology and connects everything up. So we expect that from a scientific theory. We've got to be in a better position than we were before to see how it makes sense, how it makes coherent a lot of different kinds of data. Secondly, a scientific hypothesis or model should be fruitful in terms of leading to a research program and generating experimental ideas and so forth, which can then be published in good peer-reviewed journals in the scientific literature. And we've already been thinking this morning about how the theory of evolution leads to testable ideas. If you find a rabbit in the Devonian or in the Precambrian, you know, that at least would upset evolutionary history quite a bit. Now, of course, with big theories, if you want refuting data, it's very unusual to get one bit of refuting data which will bring a whole big theory crashing down. But still, if lots and lots of refuting data begin to accumulate, it would be certainly possible to refute Darwinian evolution and so on. So here we have a theory that is actually not only explains a lot of stuff, as we've been thinking about today, but also is open to refutation. And then the third key characteristic of a scientific theory, well, we've just mentioned it, is the theory should be in principle falsifiable. If there are, this is good old Karl Popper, but if there are no data at all that in principle could count against the theory, then generally speaking, scientists don't feel, certainly in biology anyway, maybe they do it in cosmology, have a little bit, but let's keep the biology here, but you know, basically biologists aren't very keen on that as a scientific theory. You know, as we're thinking this morning, if it did turn out that the genetic code was very different, you know, for different clades and different families of animals and plants around the world, then at least that would make us completely rethink the evolutionary history, I think, and so forth. Now, if we take those core ideas, right, there are more, obviously, let's start with those three. If we take those core ideas that we've been thinking about in ID, and we assess them against those three key characteristics of the scientific enterprise in biology at least, then how do they fare? And This is where my critique will come in, because I don't think they do very well, and I just want to explain that a little bit. So the problems become apparent as soon as we start on the first criterion, that is to say, the first criterion of what we count as a scientific model or theory. Does it have genuine explanatory power? Now in practice, the idea of specified complexity and explanatory filters, they only exist as thought experiments without explanatory power in the world of biology. And the reason is that there's no way in practice of using them to explain the origins of complex biological systems, whereas in fact there are much simpler biological explanations already in place. Let me just give you one example from Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. He gave the idea of blood clotting in vertebrates as an example of an irreducibly complex system that couldn't have come into being incrementally because the complete cascade involves more than 20 components that need to operate together to function properly. If you can think back to your school exams in biology, you know, all those cascades of those factors 8 and factor 7, all those proteases, and so on and so forth. That's what he's talking about here. But of course, the fact is now, and even more so that since 1996, we know a lot about the evolution of that cascade. We know that proteases, the class of enzyme called proteases, factors, make up as much as 1% of all the protein encoding genes of the genome, extremely proliferative kind of enzyme gene family, come about through gene duplication quite clearly and so on. So we know a lot about actually the evolution of the blood clotting cascade. We don't know everything about it, but we certainly know a lot about it. And so we can see sort of quite easily there's a simpler, if you like, explanation. We don't need to invoke, you know, specified complexity and all these irreducibly complex. It's not going to be helpful to biologists in the lab to really find out about that. I think one of the problems with having mathematicians and philosophers looking into kind of biological theories is simply they're just unfamiliar with the challenge of carrying out a research enterprise. They've never had to work at the bench or actually think about a biological problem and publish a paper. And so it's very easy to sit in front of a computer and come up with some sort of philosophical or mathematical idea which really doesn't do you any good in the lab. It's not really going to help you get anywhere. And so you can use analogies from code breaking and from SETI, from finding archaeological traces of, you know, intelligent life and so on and so on. You can do all that kind of stuff. But actually, biologists really don't find those kind of analogies or metaphors very helpful. You know, what use are they going to do in terms of carrying out a research enterprise and so on? And I think that helps to explain why there's just been very few publications coming out of the intelligent design movement. Now, it's notable, I think, in this respect, the only prominent biologist ID proponent, Michael Behe, doesn't actually use Dembski's mathematical ideas when he's talking about biological systems. He just prefers to refer to them as irreducibly complex. He doesn't actually use that filter that we were just thinking about that Dembski proposes. And actually, a fellow of the Discovery Institute, Paul Nelson, has recently stated, and I quote, that easily the biggest challenge facing the ID community is to develop a full-fledged theory of biological design. We don't have such a theory right now, and that's a problem. I think it was written a few years ago, and I think it's still a problem. More recently, I mentioned this book, Signature in the Cell by Steve Meyer. He likewise actually ignores Dembski's explanatory filter. Instead, he focuses on the philosophical concept of inference to the best explanation. You may be familiar with that phrase. It was very much popularized here by Peter Lipton, a very fine philosopher who sadly died a few years ago. He was Steve Meyer's PhD supervisor here in Cambridge, and so perhaps it's not surprising to see Steve utilize that particular way of thinking to try and present an argument for ID. So what he does in this particular book is to review the various current theories to explain the origin of life, as we were hearing this morning from the other Steve. That's a whole area which is very poorly understood. Certainly there are plenty of gaps in our knowledge there. But Steve Meyer concludes that he calls it the DNA enigma. You know, the origins of the genetic code. How did that come into being? How did the first sort of cell and all that kind of thing. How did that start and so forth? And he says he does a thorough search. He says, despite the thorough search described in chapters 8 to 14 of this particular book, Signature in the Cell, I found no other causally adequate explanation for the DNA enigma. And therefore, he goes from there to an inference to design. Therefore, because there's no good explanation yet, which there isn't, he's correct in that point yet, for the origins of all this complexity, therefore he kind of infers design. I find, I have to say, that a very unsatisfactory kind of argument. But I'm not quite sure, why does our ignorance of these things in the year 2012, which is, only 50 years since, we've really got into molecular biology and RNA and DNA, began to understand these things, why on earth would that particular point in our history in 2012 give us some indication that we're never going to find out more about these things? I just think that is a non sequitur. So I just don't see the argument there myself at that point. And I guess at this point it's worth reflecting about the ignorance about the molecular mechanisms of inheritance in 1859, when Darwin, of course, published his great work, The Origin of Species. I mean, Darwin really had very little idea about how inheritance worked. He proposed this idea of gemmules, which turned out to be wrong, led to a kind of idea of blending inheritance and so on, but he had to go. Other people were trying and so on. But actually, when you think about it, it took another 150 years, pretty much, before we really began to understand thoroughly the mechanism of inheritance and DNA and how that all works and so on. And so, isn't it good that the natural philosophers at the time of Darwin didn't just throw up, isn't it good they didn't throw up their arms and say, oh, it's all very complicated, I don't understand it, therefore it was designed. I'm so glad they didn't do that, okay? But they kept plugging away, and eventually got to DNA and so on. It took a long time. And I think it'll take an awfully long time, maybe longer, to really get our heads around the origin of life, and the origin of the first cell, and that's a huge research program. It's a very tricky one. Maybe we'll be helped by discovering life on other planets. That might be a real breakthrough there, but it's a long research program. So I don't see how we can possibly infer this thing called design by the present ignorance that we have. I think another significant problem with the suggestion that ID represents a scientific hypothesis with explanatory power, it comes from a false conclusion that's inherent in its argument, which is related to what I just said. So the explanatory filter basically claims that if something cannot in principle be explained by either chance or necessity, then it must be design. I just think, again, this is a non sequitur. I mean, even if one was able to decide that a biologically complex entity had not come into existence purely by chance, nor as a result of physical laws working out their consequences by necessity, there would be no grounds for thinking that a third alternative was design. I mean, a third alternative might be simply, we just don't know how this thing came into being at the present time. It's a confession of ignorance, and I think that's a point we need to keep in mind. There's also the problem as to whether design as a concept really counts as an explanation for anything. It counts as an explanation for a complex biological entity. I mean, if somebody tells me that the bacterial flagellum is very complex, and so it must be designed, in what scientific sense am I better informed than I was before? I mean, if one aim of biology is to kind of illuminate the processes whereby things have their being, and everything is always coming into being in biology all the time, it's a dynamic system, and if somebody tells me that the organization of life in some way is very complicated and so on, I can't see how my scientific knowledge has been advanced one little iota by that particular comment. And of course, as a Christian myself who believes in God as creator, I do believe that everything that exists is a reflection of the outworking of the creative purposes of God. The scientific enterprise is only possible by a prior understanding of the created order taken as a whole as intelligible. We have to, all of us, whether atheist or theist or whatever, we all have to take that intelligibility of the universe as a given before we can start on the scientific enterprise. And so just picking out little bits of that created order as inferring intelligent design, to me doesn't sound like a scientific explanation for anything in particular. We also have to ask the question, what exactly is this design that's being presented as an explanation? And so, since ID proponents are explicit in excluding the supernatural and the miraculous as they invoke design, and they always say they start there, that's, although they want to bring the supernatural back in science, they start by saying design is not something supernatural as an explanation. So then it's sort of fair to ask the question, I think, well, what is this thing design referring to? What are we talking about here? And in some ID writings, I think it sounds rather like a kind of mysterious intermediate force of the kind that Boyle was critiquing back in the 17th century as a sort of intermediate between God and nature in some way. Now, in previous centuries, when electromagnetism and the weak and strong nuclear forces were discovered, they were then labelled, they were named as such, and then they were added to the catalogue of physical forces. And I guess now we can add the Higgs boson. We can keep adding things. Once they're identified, we can give them a label and we can begin to understand their properties. And I think if there were really mysterious forces at work that helped to explain the origins of biological complexity in biology, then once they were discovered, like a sort of Higgs boson equivalent, then they would simply be incorporated into our normal biochemical narratives and so on and so forth. They would be given a label, we'd try and understand their properties, and then we'd be brought into mainstream science. But there are other times in which scientists have evoked kind of forces. We think of the élan vital of people like Bergson in the early part of the 20th century, or think of the ether in cosmology, another sort of idea. So these ideas are simply have their popularity for some decades, even for centuries in some cases, but eventually they're found to be unnecessary. You don't need them, you drop them because they're no longer necessary to do justice to the data. They don't do any explanatory work. And so I think the ID proposal of design seems to be another kind of vitalism which remains sort of vacuous as a scientific explanation. It doesn't do any work for us, and therefore, has no real content as part of a scientific explanation. You find a similar kind of vagueness. Once they move then from design to the designer, it becomes even more vague. And there's a great reluctance, I think, within the ID movement to identify the designer with the God of traditional Christian theism, let's say. I think, again, a worry about looking like a religion. They don't want to look like a religion. And so this is illustrated by a rather nice interview here with Michael Beattie, which was published in The Guardian in 2005. Here we have John Sutherland interviewing Michael Beattie. Sutherland, I'm quoting here from The Guardian. "It's no secret that you are a Catholic, but as I understand it, your scientific theory does not predicate God in any form whatsoever. You suggested that the designer could even be some kind of evil alien. Is that right?" Michael Beattie replied, "That's exactly correct. All that the evidence from biochemistry points to is some very intelligent agent. Although I find it congenial to think that it's God, others might prefer to think it's an alien." Back to aliens again today. Keep going there. Or who knows, an angel, or some satanic force, some new age power, something we don't know anything about yet. So it's sort of left very vague and open. We'll come back to that point in a moment. Now, we looked about the first criterion for a successful scientific theory, that it provides a good explanation for data and renders them coherent. What about the second criterion for a fruitful scientific enterprise or hypothesis, and that's its testability? Now, here again, I think ID, in my mind anyway, seems rather scientifically sterile. I mean, let's imagine that I have a PhD student in my lab and I give him or her the challenge to understand the evolution of the bacterial flagellum, and they spend a couple of years out there in the lab and in front of the computer and so on and so forth. They come back after a couple of years, they say it's really complicated, this thing has got 30 or 40 components, I don't understand it, therefore it's designed, I give up. It must be designed. Okay, so what are you going to do then to find counter-evidence for that? I mean, what experiment would you do to counter that claim? And I can't think of any. And I've actually, in debate with ID proponents, I've often said, please, just give me one experiment, that would sort of refute the idea of design of this thing, and they've never been able to give me anything. So I think the answer really is that there is no, there simply isn't anything that would counter, in scientific terms, in experimental terms, that particular claim, and for this reason, ID has often been criticized for being creatively sterile as a sort of potential science stopper. You just contrast that with the ability of evolutionary mechanisms to explain an amazing array. I mean, just listening to Robert this morning and also listening to Steve, evolution actually does a good job, an amazing job actually, at explaining so many things, anatomy and physiology and genetics and history and paleontology, all the way across. It just brings into a coherent story. So there's a bit of a contrast there. And I think ID also suffers kind of thing from the fallacy of large numbers. Now, if you take a multi-component system like a flagellum, you can easily come up with big numbers. If you actually thought that sprang into being, you know, all at once on one day, of course, you know, that's not going to happen. I mean, except for a miracle. So, you know, you can easily come up with very large numbers showing that's impossible. I mean, of course, but by the same token, no Darwinian thinks that's how complex things come into being. They come into being by gradual, incremental sort of systems. And I guess there's a problem in thinking about life, you know, biological life, that the definition of life is that it is a complex system. Otherwise it wouldn't be living. The definition of living thing is it's pretty complicated. You know, this vast array of molecules and things that have to interact. So immediately you have that. Everything, all living things are irreducibly complex. By definition, that's what, if you like, gives them their properties as a living entity. And so if you can define all of biological, well, every biological entity as being irreducibly complex, you end up with actually a theory that, since it explains everything, explains nothing. If you have I mean, the point about an explanation is it should be distinguishing between certain categories of entity. Now, the third critical point I want to make about scientific theories, of course, as we've already mentioned, is their falsifiability. I've already mentioned that point, so I think I'll skip over it. But as I say, we can't really think of anything, you know, that would refute a claim from an ID proponent about an irreducibly complex system. A few years ago, there was a famous, an infamous trial in Dover, and it was all about whether ID could be taught in the school classroom in this small town in Pennsylvania. After listening to 6 weeks of testimony at that trial back in 2005, Judge Jones concluded that ID was not science but religion and should not therefore be taught in US schools. I actually think that Judge Jones was correct in his decision. Now, that then would raise the question, what kind of religious belief is it that ID is representing? It certainly, to me, looks like a kind of revived form of natural theology. Now, Dembski, in particular, is very resistant to that suggestion. We'll be able to quote from him, but it does seem to me that it looks like natural theology. I mean, for example, if you think of a bacterial flagellum, which has 40 different components, and it comes into being all on one day, you know, out of the blue, as it were, that looks to me like a miracle, actually. I can't think of any other word than it would be some sort of supernatural act. I mean, if it wasn't there the day before, then it suddenly popped into being. You know, that would be, well, it sounds like at least a strong form of natural theology. I think most people would be tempted to call that pretty miraculous, actually. Now, in response, Dembski suggests that it is, and I quote from Dembski here, it is a logical possibility that the design in the bacterial flagellum was front-loaded into the universe at the Big Bang, and subsequently expressed itself in the course of natural history as a miniature motor-driven propeller on the back of the E. coli bacteria. Next quote. Now, I actually find that really hard to find any coherence in their claim, let alone evidence. I think it's sort of difficult to avoid the impression sometimes when you read the ID literature that really what they want to do is have sort of hundreds and hundreds of little miracles. I'm actually reminded of the medieval church. I mean, the medieval church in Europe, you know, just life was full of miracles. The bones of the saints, the blood of Virgin, and all kinds of them. You go around the ancient European cathedrals today, and there's still just lots and lots of those sort of relics still hanging around, which I think have largely been somewhat excluded from parts of the church, not all. But it just seems to me, when I think about the role of miracles in the medieval church, it sounds like what the ID folk want to do is to bring back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miracles, you know, into biology, into science. So every now and again, God does this and God does that, and God does the genetic code, and God does the flagellum, and so on and so on. And it just seems to me like some sort of form maybe of natural theology. Maybe we can discuss that. Now, I mean, there are many different species of natural theology. I've got time, especially now, to look into every species, but I guess a significant problem, of course, with the kind of ID line of thinking is that it's a sort of designer of the gaps argument. We're probably familiar with the God of the gaps argument, that here we have the sort of yellow box here of scientific knowledge. We have lots and lots of gaps in our knowledge, and some people would like to label those gaps with the word God. And what you have in the intelligent design movement is they are labeling this with the word design or designer, and of course it's a hostage to fortune, we say in English. In other words, it's very likely that science will very soon close those gaps, and that that role for design or designer will be gradually excluded. And you can see that happening actually in the ID literature, even though over its brief history of 20 years that they will start on one thing like the flagellum, that will then get explained pretty well in evolutionary terms. They'll then move on to something a little bit different and so on. So constantly moving on to the next gap in our scientific knowledge. I want to finish, just spend a few more minutes in thinking a little bit about the whole notion of naturalism and natural laws in the ID literature, because they use this term in a rather special way. Let me quote from Dembski here. Dembski stated that it's only when natural laws are viewed as incomplete, so that without the activity of an intelligent agent, it is not possible to bring about a given object of nature, that natural theology can remain a valid enterprise. Close quote. Now, I think first of all, ID proponents should learn from history. If you base your natural theology on gaps in your present knowledge, as we've just been thinking, then that's a very fragile position to take. And so more robust views of natural theology see the whole panoply, if you like, the whole array of God's actions in the universe, which we investigate as scientists, as reflecting the wisdom and power of God. I like this slogan from Augustine, written in his great commentary on Genesis in the early part of the 6th century, where he says that nature is what God does. Nature is what God does. In other words, nature is simply the word that we use for the created order, which has God as its ultimate source and origin. And so if you go to Augustine, then you go to Aquinas and so on, you get a very robust view of God's actions as creator. And so that raises, I think, the broader question of how this word naturalism and nature and naturalistic and so on are deployed in the ID literature. And you actually find meanings attached to them which are quite different from those you'll find in the dictionary. So here's the Oxford Dictionary. Must be right, Oxford Dictionary. Definition of naturalism in the context of philosophy, quite straightforward. It's the view of the world that excludes the supernatural or spiritual. Now clearly, there are people within the scientific community who are naturalistic in their philosophy, in that point. But equally, there are many theists and many believers within the scientific community who are not naturalistic in their thinking by that definition. And so clearly, a believer in God who does science cannot carry out their science naturalistically because they believe in a supernatural creator of all that exists, and that is the opposite of naturalism. Nevertheless, here we have some comments from Philip Johnson. He says the following, and I quote from Johnson here: "It is conceivable that God for some reason did all the creating by apparently naturalistic processes, perhaps the better to test our faith, but surely this is not the only possibility. My writings and those of colleagues like Michael Behe argue that design is detectably present in biology, that naturalistic substitutes like the blind watchmaker mechanism are inadequate and contrary to the evidence." And Johnson further comments that theistic evolution can more accurately be described as theistic naturalism. Now just think about that for a little bit, okay? Theistic naturalism is surely an oxymoron, okay? That word in English, oxymoron, intrinsically contradictory. So Christian theism, the kind of theism to which Johnson is referring in this passage, refers to the belief in a creator God who is the origin and sustainer of all that exists. And so God cannot possibly create by apparently naturalistic processes, for the simple reason that if there is a God, he creates, then there are no naturalistic processes, because naturalism is false. I hope you follow me there. We can come back to it if you like. But when you look at the writings of ID, it's sort of suggesting there's a kind of two-tier universe. There's a naturalistic tier which involves natural laws, and then the other tier kind of involves design. And so Dembski comments that the design theorist is not committed to every biological structure being designed. Naturalistic mechanisms like mutation and selection do operate in natural history to adapt organisms to their environments, close quote. And then again, another quote from Dembski, if specified complexity is exhibited in actual biological systems, we are justified in attributing such systems to design. That's not to say that every aspect of such systems is designed. Notice this in brackets. Some aspects may be due to purely natural forces. And so Dembski is sort of envisaging a biological world largely explained by naturalistic mechanisms and natural forces, and it's against that backcloth that the design systems may be detected. Indeed, if you didn't have that backcloth within his framework, you wouldn't be able to detect his so-called designed components and so on. So the one is actually, it's all tied together in a package here, which is quite interesting to kind of dissect out. So the ID literature then gives the impression that there's something inherently naturalistic about certain aspects of the created order and not about other aspects. And I have to say, from the perspective of the Abrahamic faith, such thinking, I think, appears to stem from a very inadequate concept of the doctrine of creation, because in creation theology, as we've been thinking, the created order is a seamless web of God's creative activity. The technical term is the immanence of God in creation. God is the composer and conductor of the music of life. It's a dynamic process. Creation is not static. Creation is past, present, and future. And in traditional Christian theology, God is the ground of all existence. God is the source of all that exists. And so all we can do is describe and seek to understand that existence. And God is continually sustaining, upholding the created order, just as that conductor is conducting the music of life, if you like. We can use various metaphors there. And so science is definitely not a naturalistic enterprise for the believer who is a scientist, but rather a cause for worshipping God who has brought this wonderful, intelligible universe into being, including all its biological complexity. So I prefer to go with Robert Boyle, back in the 17th century. It more sets off the wisdom of God and the fabric of the universe, that he can make so vast a machine perform all those many things which he designed it should by the mere contrivance of brute matter managed by certain laws of local motion. So it's left up to us as the biological community to find out how it all works, what are the mechanisms, and how does it all come to be. And I think that's actually fantastic. There are so many gaps in our biological knowledge, because if it wasn't so, biologists would be out of a job. It's fantastic. We have so many gaps we can write grants about and get enthusiastic about and try and fill. And I think there are gaps that will give every biologist a fantastic career for at least another century or so. And so I will finish on that rather encouraging note. Thank you very much.
Okay, well,
little plug for books. There's quite a bit. There's a couple of chapters on intelligent design in this book. Creation and evolution. Do we have to choose? I don't know. Is that book on the bookstore? I don't know. Anyway,
it is. Yes.
On the bookstore. It's got also a chapter I wrote on ID. And I have sworn, I'll say this to camera, I swore never to write another chapter on ID again. I've done my so,
okay, well, David has a question.
Since you've said at the same time that you were never going to write another chapter on ID and that you were going to make this a gentle critique, I'll be a little bit less gentle and just ask whether it's your opinion that the architects of the ID movement, as you've identified them, whether it's your experience in debating them and writing and discussing things with them, that they actually believe the arguments that they portray, or are they merely a sort of a pseudo-scientific front for their religious concerns, and so they actually would not respond with sensible counter-arguments or have their beliefs or ideas evolve over time in response to these debates and arguments. And if it's actually the latter, the cynical alternative, is it actually helpful to debate them or argue with them in these terms?
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that is a good question, one I've thought quite a bit about. I find it probably distasteful or difficult, at least, to try and infer wrong motives to somebody who, you know, I prefer to read their writings and just, as we've been in here, to repeat what they say and then look at that in a critical way, maybe, because sometimes we could infer motivations to people and be wrong, and that's quite easy to do in any kind of discussion. So I prefer to avoid that. I would simply say I think my impression is that there is a whole range in what you just mentioned. Now, I will say, because I don't think Steve Fuller would mind this being said, because we always go for a drink after our debate and have a, you know, kind of friendly discussion. It seems to me for Steve, he's quite postmodern in his thinking, and it actually is a bit of a game. You know, he's not taking any particular religious view on this. He rather likes the idea, you know, that the scientific community should have a lot of conflicting ideas in there. That's good fun, you know. And he looks back at the history of science and says, hey, that's good fun when you have lots of conflict. And this whole Darwinism thing is too monolithic, you know. That's dangerous. We shouldn't have that sort of situation in science. We should bring in some counter voices. So it's sort of playing with ideas. I think Monton also is a little bit in that category as well. You know, philosophically, it's just fun to play with. You know, it's. But I think there are people probably within the ID, the more religiously committed ID proponents, who probably, I mean, have a pretty clear strategy that they are avoiding trying to portray ID as a religious movement because of it's the Fifth Amendment, isn't it? I mean, is the separation between church and state in the States? Yeah. Which one is it? The first. First. Sorry, I thought that was wrong when I said it. Yeah, the First Amendment. So they want to avoid, the accusation that they are bringing a religion into the classroom and so on. They want to make this look like a proper sort of scientific movement, and I think that is a cover. Yeah, in some cases, I think that is the case.
Thank you. John?
That last point, Dennis, that does raise the question about what is the force or the designer envisaged by those who come at this with no religious agenda or religious faith indeed, because as you said, there are agnostics and atheists in this area, and I'm just trying to picture what actually is their hypothesis for the designer or the design mechanism.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I've asked that question, and often it's a bit like the interview with Michael Behe and Sutherland that I quoted from The Guardian. They kind of back off into vagueness at that point, and I think we almost have to go back to Voltaire, his idea that there's some intelligence out there, something's going on, In actual fact, I mean, if you look at Paul Davies, who, as a cosmologist who takes no particular personal religious commitment, but he would say that from the point, we're leaping out of biology now into the world of anthropic fine-tuning and the cosmological properties of the universe and so on, he would say, oh, there's something going on there, we don't know what it is. Is it a sort of, is it an abstract intelligence or something's happening here? So he wouldn't call himself an atheist for that reason. How could you believe in atheism? Very like Voltaire, actually. That's why I quoted from Voltaire, because I hear the echoes of Voltaire quite often in some of these discussions. But my experience has been that the specific ID proponents are very hesitant about saying anything at all. Now, except in their specifically Christian theological writings, then they will come out and say, yeah, well, it's the God. Actually, Steve Meyer does that in his book Signature in the Soul, and said, well, for me as a Christian, I would infer the designer as being God, the God of traditional Christian theism. But not all the proponents would do that, I think, yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Philosopher Andrew Flew, I think Anthony,
Yes.
he's reportedly, before his death, he kind of moved away from atheism, came back to some form of deism or
Yes.
whatever.
Yes.
And it is said that was because of the complexity of the DNA and the genetic code. Is
Yeah.
that something like specified complexity, or would you
Yes.
like to elaborate, please?
Well, I think that's a very interesting example. So here you have a very, and for people, maybe I should just give a little bit of background on Antony Flew. I mean, Antony Flew, for decades, was the sort of the big name in atheism in this country, in the world of philosophy. So long before people had heard about Dawkins or Peter Atkins, or take your favorite atheist, Lawrence Krauss or somebody from North America, Antony Flew was the hero in the atheistic sort of community. And as he got older, actually, he absolutely right, he moved away from that. And he was persuaded by basically an ID kind of argument, that biology is so complicated, it's so complex, there must be some sort of designer or something. But he never called himself a theist, he never became a Christian or any other religion. He always said, I'm no longer an atheist, but I am a deist. And he would say very specifically that word, I'm a deist. So I always thought it ironic that one of the most famous atheists in this country became a deist through the arguments of essentially what the ID proponents are saying. Yeah, I think there's a great irony there, quite interesting. And all it means, I mean, people lose their atheism for all kinds of reasons, and people can turn to another religion for all kinds of reasons and so on, which aren't necessarily, one might not feel, are the kind of best reasons or the most logical reasons, but that's what happens. That's just sort of human history. And humans are infinitely diverse in the way they come to some sort of faith. Often it's not through philosophical arguments.
Yes.
You've convinced me that intelligent design doesn't follow the scientific method. I was thinking, though, that in relation to Behe's point that you made about the logical possibility of the bacterial flagellum being front-loaded, if you have a view of God as an unconstrained causal agent, there's nothing illogical about Michael Behe's view, because God can do anything. But if you have a view of God as some way constrained by evolution, then is that a bit of an oxymoron, a constrained God? So do you think that God is constrained or unconstrained as a causal agent? My question.
Your comment actually is very well made, a very good one. It slightly reminds me of Bertrand Russell's slightly humorous comment, that God could have created us all 2 minutes ago, complete with our memories and the holes in our socks. Now, that was a little bit of a kind of typical Bertrand Russell kind of comment. But I think, so in other words, clearly God is unconstrained. I mean, clearly if we believe in a God who's all-powerful and omnipotent, that's what we're referring to. And so we can always say God can do what he wants. Of course, that's logically possible. But I think what we also have to say that all our experience of the created order that we're studying so far on this planet, with these particular properties, leads us to expect, that God has given us minds and abilities and wisdom, to enable to investigate the universe, investigate the world around us. And it seems that he sort of left us with that job to do. He certainly hasn't told us about any of that stuff in the Bible. There's no science in the Bible. That's not what it's about. So he's left it to us to investigate. Now, so in a sense, that whole process of doing science is an act of trust in God and the faithfulness of God, in the fact there are scientific laws that are consistent. We call it gnomic regularity. So the universe displays gnomic regularity. So that's why we can do experiments. That's why we have reproducibility of experiments and so on. So in other words, I would see the whole scientific enterprise as an act of trust in a God who is faithful and who maintains this universe, which has rational properties that we can actually investigate. Now, of course, logically speaking, God could always do something different. And that gets us into a different kind of discussion, which is the discussion of, let's say, biblical miracles and so on and so forth. But if we're just keeping to the normal properties, if you like, the background properties of the matter of the universe in which we live, all that we've experienced so far is that these properties are behaved consistently and coherently. In other words, when we do an experiment on Monday, or we publish it in a paper, the guys down in Australia, in Melbourne, can repeat it under the same conditions. And so that, to me, displays a trust in God's faithfulness. I mean, scientific laws have deep theological roots. I mean, as a concept, the concept of law you only start finding in the writings of Descartes, Newton, and Boyle. And it's very clear from their writings that the understanding of a scientific law comes directly out of theology. And it's because they believed in God as a moral lawgiver that they then made an inference, oh well, if God is a moral lawgiver, then he's also must have created scientific laws which we can discover. And they thought about it as discovering a lost continent. All the lost continents, you know, from the European perspective, were being discovered. And so at that point, the idea of law then became the idea of an undiscovered continent. You know, it's there waiting for us to discover. But the point about it is that it displays the faithfulness of God in rendering this universe intelligible. So I'm not disagreeing with you, but I'm saying, although lots and lots of things can be logically possible if you think about the omnipotence of God, it does seem, in all our experience that we have so far, that God has created a nomically regular operating system that we live in. And actually, that's the only way in which moral responsibility is possible, if you start thinking about it.
I'm trying to get my head around what he means by this logical possibility of front-loading. Does he simply not mean that in some sense everything that exists now is implicit in the simple whatever you had at the Big Bang?
I think he thinks something more mathematical, that somehow the mathematical representation of a flagellum or something somehow is sort of there at the beginning, and then it pops out, you know, as it sort of emerges, if you like, at a particular moment in the universe's history. I mean, it's not a very coherent idea, as far as I can but maybe Robert can enlighten us. Or, yes.
I want you to further enlighten us. And specifically, it strikes me that maybe, is there some similarity between inevitability, as we were discussing this morning, and this inevitability of a flagellum somehow based on the conditions of the Big Bang?
Yeah, that's the
I mean,
point
if he was only claiming, you know, I mean, in a sense, I mean, I've looked at that kind of front-loading thing, and I thought, well, there is a way you could spin that. So you could make it mean, well, implicit in the Big Bang is all the properties of the universe, because once you have those early, you know, emergence of properties in the early femtoseconds, you know, following the Big Bang, then the carbon, phosphorus, nitrogen, oxygen will eventually be made in the second-generation stars, and so on and so on. So in a sense, now if that's what front-loading means, that eventually you're going to get to a flagellum because carbon-based life is going to happen somewhere in this vast universe of 10 to the 22 stars, if that's what it means, well, I don't have a problem with that. I mean, that's more like Simon Comment Morris, actually.
Yeah.
I don't think that's what he means. Actually, it doesn't look like that, okay. But, you know, it's not a major part of the ID thinking, but I just mention it because it does crop up now and again in the ID literature, so to be fair. So, I suspect there are some ID proponents who probably don't believe it or, you know, don't think it's a very good idea.
And do they think, though, that the flagellum is created at a particular moment complete? It's kind of what you were implying.
That's what it sounds like. That's what it sounds like. That actually you have this sort of, it just pops into being. That's why I say it sounds to me like a kind of miracle. I mean, you know, the miracle happens. Pop, you know, one day you've got this bacteria kind of not swimming very well, and then pop, next day it's got a flagellum. I mean, I don't want to make fun of it, but that actually is what it sounds like.
Well, that's very hard to square with the general evolutionary story.
It does not square with the evolutionary story, and I always think, you know, if you think about what bacteria can do to you, and especially pathogenic bacteria, you know, they do a lot more harm if they're swimming around. I just think there's a kind of theodicy problem there as well, but I don't know if we want to go there.
Keith has a question.
That was going to be my question, is the designer also responsible for designing things that might be responsible for suffering and evil? And you just touched on
Yes,
that.
I mean, so Francisco Ayala, who's a great Catholic evolutionary biologist in North America at the University of California, so he has several books where he basically thinks that kind of evolution is the answer to the theodicy problem, because there, you know, it's just all these mechanisms over here which happen, and that's the way evolution works. So it's not God's fault, you know, that things die, you know, and have a rough time. So I'm slightly, you know, kind of summarizing it rather crudely there, but I actually don't agree with Francisco on that point, actually. And the reason is, and that comes into the ID thing as well. So okay, so in the intelligent design view, if you suddenly have a flagellum, boom, that's created, out of nothing, suddenly appears and gives the pathogenic bacteria great advantage to give you cholera or something, or typhoid or something else horrible. I mean, that doesn't look very good either, because that's a very specific kind of creating something even worse. But it seems to me that we cannot get off the hook, those of us who don't believe that. We're still left with the problem of theodicy, because if you think of a God who is immanent in the created order, as I've just been suggesting, I mean, I think that is a more traditional view and understanding of God as creator, that God is intimately involved by his Spirit in upholding and sustaining all that exists, and that's why we do have an intelligible universe. So that's a really involved God. I'm proposing the idea of a really involved God, okay, as a musician who's composing the music, if you like, for some analogy you want to use there. So that doesn't really, so in other words, we have to say, well, this universe, with all its particular properties, must be the outworking then of God's purposes. We can't, I mean, I think the problem with Francisco Ayala's view is, I mean, if you imagine a driver, and the driver's at the top of the hill, okay, and the driver just takes his hands off the wheel and says, oh, well, I'll let the car go down any way it wishes. Halfway down, the car, runs over a child and kills it, okay. Now, who's responsible for that? Well, I think the driver is. I mean, taking the hands off the wheel doesn't lessen the responsibility of the driver. So all these kind of arguments about theodicy, where you have a God who sort of lets things be, I don't think that to me is not satisfactory as an argument, personally.
But in contrast to that, the idea is saying that the designer is deliberately making things that are evil and cause suffering, which is rather different.
I think it is rather different. Yeah, that sounds to me like, oh well, the bacteria haven't got, they're not good enough to kill things, so let's give them a better chance. I think that is a slight increase in the theodicy problem, I think. Yeah, that's right.
You didn't, I thought you had a, Fiona, you didn't have a, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. It was picking up on an earlier point. There's some data to suggest that, yes, although the flagellum is incredibly complex, that some of the components that go into that flagellum also have uses in other more primitive systems. So the flagellum itself has sort of evolved from the parts of other bits.
Right, thank you for raising that point. So, yes indeed, so there's a 10-protein submodule within the bacterial flagellum that is called the type 3 secretory system, and that's used by other bacteria for injecting toxins into other ones. So the type 3 secretory system is a very nice little submodule. It has its own selective advantage. It's all over the place in many, many bacterial species. I believe now almost every single protein, and by the way, you have also an ATPase pump in them. That's also all over the place in bacteria. So there are lots of submodules within the flagellum which have their own selective advantage. I think pretty much now every single component, maybe one or two missing in the bacterial flagellum, has been shown to have some other role in bacteria, and some other, even in the same bacterium, has like flagellin and so on. It crops up all over the place in bacterium. Now, of course, the problem with the evolution of bacteria, as you know, is lateral gene transfer. Okay, so lateral gene transfer is what bacteria do all the time, and so it's very difficult to construct kind of evolutionary trees of the kind we were looking at this morning because of lateral gene transfer. Once you have that, how do you do? Once you've got vertical trees, you're in good shape. You can make a nice tree. Once you have lateral gene transfer where genes are being swapped around bacteria all the time, then it's very hard to know which comes first, which strain and so forth. That's quite hard, actually.
Any more questions? Yes. Descendant of John Tyndall.
Oh, really?
Great uncle or great
Fantastic. Yeah, are you also a fiery Irish physicist?
great not.
Oh, that's
He's an Anglican priest.
There you go. Oh, well, that gives greatest interest.
Part of the issue
Yeah.
with the ID folk is, I think, a confusion between methodology and metaphysics. A reading of science, the scientific method, and implying into that an outcome that says the world is only determined by naturalistic understanding. And I wonder too whether in fact the danger of the debate as a whole is that caricatures can be set up that are then easy to knock down, but perhaps we need to critique the caricatures that are actually put up in the first place. For example, it might be a caricature of what Darwin was actually about, which wasn't necessarily naturalistic in the full sense of the word. It might be caricatures of what religion says that some people may say they want to knock down. And I think we need to be aware of those sort of false idols that get put up as a very easily knocked down, that can actually take us away from the pursuit of truth.
Thank you very much for both of those points. I think those points very well made. And I think you're absolutely right about the mingling of language. Once you introduce language of teleology and philosophy into science and you start mingling that with the scientific language, you're really going back to Aristotelian science, really, and if you look at it, I mean, early modern science only really took off when it said, well, actually, we can't talk about ultimate goals, we can't talk about telos in terms of an ultimate telos, as in the more Aristotelian science, because we just don't know how to go about that. So let's focus on what's achievable, or the art of the soluble, in Peter Medaway's famous book title. So science is about the art of the soluble, and what we can do is very limited, therefore. And once you start introducing ultimate telos again, ultimate teleology into science as in the ID language, then it begins to become very confusing, I think. But thank you also for the point about caricatures. I think that is correct. And of course, Darwin is often held up as the great bogeyman, the great sort of, I mean, many people think Darwin was an atheist because he wasn't an atheist. He studied, did a degree here in Cambridge, which included lots of divinity. Read lots of William Paley, who's later on said in his autobiography that Paley was the only person I read here in Cambridge that was of the least use to my mind, and so he always had to memorize William Paley, natural theology. People have called The Origin of Species the last great work of Victorian natural theology, because it's so shaped by the thinking of natural theology that he learnt here in Cambridge. And so on. And he was very clear that he said he became an agnostic. Once Thomas Henry Huxley made up the word agnostic in 1869, as soon as Darwin heard that from his friend, he said, yes, I'm one of those. So he started calling himself agnostic. But he said very clearly in a letter, I've never called myself an atheist. He was a classic doubter. Classic doubter. Lucky chap.
Well, it's gone 1:30. I think we might just... Okay, we do squeeze you in for one last question?
Yeah.
Quick.
What do you think the proponents of ID make of Lamarckism?
Oh, what's that? Oh, Lamarckism?
Yeah.
Don't know.
Has that ever come up?
Yeah, I've never seen... I'm just trying to think, I've read quite a lot of ID books. I can't remember them ever sort of discussing Lamarckism particularly. So I don't know. That's a nice, get us finished on time.